Hello my friends, just some things I was thinking about. This is 100 years since 1914. This little account here is really along the lines of the Great War. What was it really like? Many would still like to glorify in that war and other wars. They behave as if it's a noble and good thing for men in one nation to go off to war with men in another nation. But what was World War I really like? This book here is called the 20th Century History of Britain, and this particular chapter is called The First World War. It's by a lady called Mary Cathcart Borrer, and she had this to say. In 1914, men had in their hands the products of the new technical discoveries of the 19th and early 20th centuries to use for good or ill. The worst now happened. They used their newly acquired skills for wholesale destruction of mankind, such as had never been contemplated by the most savage and inhumane of aggressors. She goes on here to say that at the start of the war, artillery hadn't been mechanised. It was being drawn by horses. The Royal Flying Corps consisted of 100 men with 66 aeroplanes with open cockpits. Submarines hadn't even been developed. In fact, Napoleon had considered them to be too diabolical. Poisonous gas had never been used, and tanks hadn't even been devised. 4 years later, submarines and tank warfare were an accepted part of all conflict, and the manufacture of all types of guns, from machine guns to the giant howitzers, with the accompanying iron, steel and engineering trades, was an industry which employed 3 million workers in Great Britain alone. What was it like to be on the receiving end of that kind of warfare? If you want to know what it was like to be under heavy artillery fire, read this book, August 1914, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was in the Russian army at that time and experienced what it was like to be under constant artillery barrage on the Eastern Front in World War I. It is not pleasant reading. It would have been absolutely horrific. The Awake magazine of this year, the magazine for February of this year, had this to say. The statesman promised that the war would open the way to a new and better world. The generals promised a quick and easy victory. In fact, people in Britain thought that it would be a war to end all wars, and that it would very quickly be over, but we know it soon became a grueling stalemate of mass destruction of people. But worst of all, the clergy supported the war enthusiastically. One of the quotes here, this is from a book called A History of Christianity, says clergymen were unable and for the most part unwilling to place Christian faith before nationality. Most took the easy way out and equated Christianity with patriotism. Christian soldiers of all denominations were exhorted to kill each other in the name of their Saviour. How sad and how wrong that was. I was born in 1951, the son of an RAF man from the Second World War. But on my mother's side, my grandfather was Joseph Smith. He grew up in Wolverhampton. And he trained, family rumour has it, in France for some reason as a stable lad. He absolutely loved horses. He moved to Aston Tyrol, which was a village with racing stables, where he worked at those stables. And then he met Elizabeth Smith, the village postmistress. They were soon married. I'm not absolutely sure of the year, but it was somewhere close to 1914. They were a happy couple. They weren't wealthy. In fact, they were quite poor, but they did have work, or he did. They had a home. Life was good. He was working with the horses that he loved. He was with the woman that he loved. She was with the man she loved. He was a singer in the local pub as well. He liked to sing. And then the war broke out. Now, this isn't the place to examine the reasons that the assassination of an archduke led to this conglomeration of destruction and wickedness. But that's what happened, and Joseph went to fight. I'm not sure whether he was waiting till he was called up, because there was conscription introduced, of course, or whether he went because the clergy encouraged him to, or because he felt it was the right thing to do. But what I do know is that he was in the middle of some terrible battles in that trench warfare. He would come home on leave. He'd have to be deliced because they were covered in fleas and lice, the men in the trenches. On one occasion he came home and his wife Elizabeth, my grandmother, became pregnant. Joseph returned to the trenches and more terrible battles. My pregnant grandmother, Elizabeth, was informed that he was missing, presumed dead. Eventually, their daughter Marjorie was born. Can you imagine being a woman with a newborn first child, your husband missing, presumed dead, in First World War Britain? If you've watched the BBC television series Downton Abbey, that's what life was like there, only with the romance taken out that is in that television programme. The peasants were the peasants, really, still. She'd lost her husband, the man she loved, the father of the child. Also, she would have been distress and trauma and sadness, but her breadwinner had gone as well. Women with babies didn't work in those days. How would she cope with the grief and the economic situation? Now for her it was a blessing that eventually, after 10 months, he turned up in a military hospital. Apparently him and some other men had been cut off from British lines, but was rescued and in an injured condition. And my grandmother was apparently overjoyed when she received a postcard from him in the post, suddenly from this hospital. I'm overjoyed he came back, because if he hadn't come back, my mother would never have been conceived, which means she would never have been born, and I certainly wouldn't have been born then. But so many millions didn't come back. Also, he didn't come back a better man for being in that terrible war. He was traumatised. He had injuries that gave him trouble for the rest of his life. He was also full of shrapnel in his legs, which worked its way out every so often. If he was asked the question, what was it really like, he wouldn't answer it. He found it all too distressing, and he was never the same again. In fact, he drank quite a lot, which was probably some kind of escapism. Many were in that situation, and he was one of what they would call the fortunate ones. My friends, how much we should hate all attempts, whether they're from the generals, the statesmen, or the clergymen, to glorify World War I or any kind of war. How much we should prompt people to see what the scriptures really say about war, and also to understand the real meaning behind 1914 and those terrible events. Just my meandering mind really, thinking about how one little family in a village, my family, were affected in 1914 by the war. But when you look at the war memorials in all those villages throughout Britain and Ireland, you come to realise that actually, for many, it was even worse. Thanks for considering what I got to say. Nice to talk with you, my friends, and I certainly wish you peace and love. Bye bye.